Actually, first of all, thank you all very much for coming, and missing Mr. Corbyn and Mr. Johnson. It's very kind of you coming. I was 7 when the war was coming to an end, and I had no pre-war memories, obviously. So war was normal to me, and I remember, as the war was coming to an end, wondering what peace would be like. All I could think of was just an absence of war, very negative view, really. The point of that little story is that war was normality for me. Even as adults, we tend to think that what's normal for us is normal, generally. We sometimes hear, for example, of battered wives who think that that's what marriage is about, very sadly. And we're used to first past the post, and so it may seem normal, but it isn't. Most democracies, especially in Europe, use some form of proportional representation, and first past the post is an exception. When we think about PR, which I think I'll use the abbreviation more now I've got started, we have to think differently. For example, many people sometimes say that PR doesn't work unless parties cooperate with each other, which they wouldn't do in the UK. But I think they would. They'd soon learn, like their continental comrades. Although the Tory Lib Dem coalition in 2010 is still controversial now, and some of you may disagree with its policies, it did work and it did provide stable government for 5 years. Now, even in the UK, first past the post isn't the only system used. On this slide, you can see the number of voting systems already used in the UK. Some of them, of course, aren't used in this area, but you do use at least 2 or 3 in this area. Obviously, you use first past the post for electing MPs. In local elections, you use either first past the post or what I call FN past the post, where N is the number of candidates. As you know, in local elections, often a ward has 3 members and you elect 3 together, so it's the first 3 past the post. Or it might be the first 2 past the post in some wards.
Yes, we certainly can.
Also, in this area, as with the rest of Great Britain, you elect MEPs through a proportional system, which we did last May. But in other parts of the UK, other systems are also in use. The devolved governments in Scotland, Wales and London use the additional member system, or AMS, and in Scotland they use STV, single transferable vote, for their local elections. Also, you may be familiar with supplementary vote, which we use for electing police and crimes commissioners, and where there are such things, directly elected mayors. So there is quite a variety of systems in this country already. I prefer to spend more time really on the principles than on the details of all of these systems, which could get us quickly bogged down. And we'll come back to the 3 PR systems mentioned later. But if you do have any questions at this stage, I'll do my best to answer them before we move on. All right. Next slide. This slide compares votes, as you can see, in West Sussex in the 2015 general election. It's a little out of date, but it doesn't matter. It's the principle we're looking at, rather than the details of a particular election. There's a very stark contrast there, where every one of the 8 seats was Conservative. But if you look at the pie chart, you'll see that I haven't actually worked it out, calculated in detail, but a quick glance at the chart shows that maybe there would have been, I'd say about 4 Tories, about half the votes are Conservative, and say 2 each for Labour and UKIP, and 1 Lib Dem. And then, if we move on to the next slide, to show that PR isn't just something that's anti-Tory, you can see the situation in Wolverhampton, where a fairly similar looking chart actually produced all Labour seats. In this case, if there were 6 seats in Wolverhampton, you see there might have been say 3 Labour, slightly less than half the votes, 2 Tory and 1 UKIP. Now, neither of these slides from 2015 is a forecast for this election, of course. Politics is very volatile now. For example, UKIP has been largely replaced by the Brexit party. The Lib Dems had a big resurgence in the European elections earlier this year. Although they slipped back a bit now, they're still higher than they were in 2015. It still gives you a broad comparison between seats and votes. In other words, it's not just a question of what government we have, but what local representation we have. It does seem fundamentally wrong to me that although this is a majority Conservative area, the large minority of Labour voters are unrepresented. And of course exactly the reverse in Wolverhampton. If we now turn to a national example, this was the general election in 1983, where Mrs Thatcher won a landslide majority of 144, with only 42.4% of the votes. In that particular example, it's interesting to see the Lib Dems and Labour are pretty much the same. I think Lib Dems are marginally lower than Labour in terms of votes, but you see the difference in seats. And as I said, 42.4% of the votes, so roughly 6 out of 10 of people had actually voted against the Conservative government. But then Labour got their own back, as it were, in 2005, when it was the other way around, and the Labour Party under Tony Blair had an even bigger landslide, with 166 majority, with even fewer votes. They only got 40.7 compared with Mrs Thatcher's 42.4. So there were just about 6 out of 10 people voted against this Labour government. And incidentally, I think it was in 2010 that the SNP won all but 3 seats in Scotland, with about 50% of the votes. The point about first past the post is it usually benefits the largest party, but it's the largest party in the area, so that in Scotland that happened to be the SNP. And by the way, it doesn't always even help the largest party. Twice in my lifetime, and probably at least once in most of yours, it's helped the second largest party. In 1951, the Labour Party got the, 1950, the Labour Party got the most votes, but, sorry, the Conservatives got the most votes, I get it right there. And Labour, most seats, and in 1974 it was the other way around. So basically that's the case for party proportional representation, but that isn't the only point about proportional representation. Many systems do provide party PR, so I'll concentrate on those already used in the UK. Could we have slide 2 again, please? Just going back to this slide, the proportional systems already used in this country are AMS, which is the 4th one down, STV, which is the bottom 2, and the regional list, which is this one. I don't think anyone has seriously suggested regional lists to be used in this country, so I won't spend much time on that. It's broadly reckoned to have been chosen by Jack Straw because he wanted the worst possible PR system to discredit all PR systems. He had to introduce it because it was an EU law to be more democratic, but all the countries had to be represented more or less proportionately by party in the European Parliament. Nevertheless, even that system, it has its merits. It is broadly proportional between parties, and it reduces tactical voting. But you may remember last May, people were talking about tactical voting. If you're a Leaver, would it be better to vote for the Brexit party, which was still very new, or UKIP, which seemed to be declining but was more established? Or if you're a Remainer, should you vote for the Green Party, which had done better than the Lib Dems in the previous Euro elections, or the Lib Dems, which seemed to be doing better then? And a lot of people wasted their votes because they made the wrong choice in their particular area. But it was tactical voting, and it seems a shame that people couldn't vote for the party they really wanted to. But as I say, there was less because with any form of PR, there's a reasonable chance that any party of a reasonable size will get some representation. AMS is one of the two systems that is seriously advocated for this country. It's a mixed system called a hybrid system. You have two votes in each election. One vote is exactly like you have at present for MPs. You vote for one person for a constituency. The other you vote for a party for a group of constituencies. And the idea is that the party votes are added up and worked out proportionately to proportion of the first past the post one. So it's a mixture, as I say, of hybrid system. That also reduces tactical voting and split votes, but it doesn't eliminate them. STV eliminates wasted votes, and parties had to help them choose a voting system. They were sitting down with a blank sheet of paper. Naturally, they wanted PR. And it was actually British politicians that suggested AMS to them. And more or less since then, AMS has been one of the front runners. It tends to be popular among political parties, particularly among, if I dare say it, top-down political parties. Because with AMS, the parties choose the candidates, like they do with first past the post, admittedly. And the voters have very little choice. On the list, they have no choice, really, other than Party A, Party B, Party C, or Party D. And who gets elected is decided by the party, because they'll put Joe Bloggs on top of the list, and Mary Smith second, and so on. In other words, the party bosses will, whether it's regionally or nationally, will choose them. Single transferable vote, I'll explain the main advantages. The main advantages, from my point of view, are to the voters themselves.
First question. How does this work with constituencies? Because at the moment, around the country, an MP is representative of their individual constituency. But if you have proportional representation, does it work like the European elections where they represent a much wider constituency? Because in that case, would we not lose the personal touch, which we might have with our own MP?
Well, it depends on the PR system itself. As the lady said, if you use the regional list system like we have for European elections, it wouldn't be very personal. I suppose it would be a little more personal than the European elections because the regions would, I guess, be smaller. But it wouldn't be very personal. With AMS, you would probably have constituencies roughly twice the size of existing ones, and you'd have one member for each constituency, one of your two votes. So that person would represent the constituency. But of course that would only be one person representing the size constituency. And if you're a Conservative voter, you may not be very happy that your MP is Labour, or vice versa. Particularly if maybe 60 or 70% of the people voted against that candidate, but they got in because the opposition was split. And, well, as I said, with the list, the parties choose them anyway. With STV, you would have a personal link. You'd have a group of about 5 constituents put together. You have 5 MPs for the constituency. They wouldn't each have a region within the constituency, but they would have what you might call political constituencies. So, if you were a supporter of one of the smaller parties, say UKIP, sorry, they don't, to be honest, they don't really exist. Say the Green Party, if you like, and they might only have one MP out of the 5 for this part of the country, but that one you would have voted for that one, and that one you would regard as your MP, but you could still go to any one of the other 4. If you were a Conservative in this area, or a Labour voter, say Wolverhampton, you might have 3 or 4 MPs of your party. which you may regard as better, which gives you a choice. You might want to go to a left-wing member or a right-wing member of your party. You might prefer a man to a woman, or an older MP to a younger MP, or vice versa.
In your hypothetical example of a single transferable vote, it wasn't clear to me how is it for a constituency and how many people are you electing?
It's, well, in theory, it could be for the whole country, but that wouldn't be practical because, you know, you'd be electing 650 together, multiply that by 4 or 5 parties for each constituency, to be ridiculous. So, in practice, it's done for constituencies, and the usual thinking is you group about 5 together. You might have slightly larger ones, say 6 or 7 in a major conurbation, in a big city or something. You might have smaller numbers, say only 2 or 3 in very large rural areas with a scattered population. But by and large you have about 5, and that gives you a fair degree of proportionality. It's a bit of a trade-off. The bigger the constituencies, in other words, the more MPs per constituency, the more proportional it is, obviously. But the fewer there are, then the smaller the ballot paper.
And can I ask, how would the rebounding of the constituencies be organised? How would that decision be made?
Well, the Electoral Commission would do that, as they do now.
Okay.
But I mean, actually, that does raise another point. I've already set me off now on another point. Quite often, in the present system, you get local authorities are split because of the need to get about the right number per constituency. When I lived in Ipswich several years ago, Ipswich was a borough and a constituency, which was all very neat and tidy, but it was growing. So what they did is they had to cut a bit out of it and link it to another. They could have just taken the north bit out and linked it to a constituency in the north or the south, linked it to one in the south or whatever. But whatever they did was likely to change the balance. So the parties were arguing about, well, we can't put all those Labour votes into that Conservative constituency, it might make it Conservative. Or we take all these Labour people out of Ipswich, that might make Ipswich Conservative. So what they did is they cut a wedge out of it. It looked like a cake with a wedge cut out. Attached that to another constituency, deliberately to try to avoid changing the result of the election. Now with SDV, you can have a, say, large town, a major city perhaps, and if it's got, say, 6 MPs at the moment, and the population declines a bit, all you do is reduce the number to 5. Or if the population grows a bit, you increase it to 7. So once you've got it set up, you don't need to change the boundaries so often. I'm sorry you started off with a second point.
No, thank you for that. Yeah, because that's what I thought with... Yeah, no, thank you.
Yeah, okay. But by and large, I think they would probably try to keep local authorities together, either a whole local authority or 2 or 3 neighbouring local authorities. But no more questions for now. Andrew,
question?
Oh, sorry.
Given the obvious advantages of proportional representation to us voters as opposed to the politicians, how on earth did we manage to lose the 2012 referendum?
Well, first of all, that wasn't about proportional representation. That was about the alternative vote. Obviously, the Conservatives didn't want any change at all. Lib Dems wanted PR. In the end, as part of the coalition negotiations, they agreed on a compromise that PR wouldn't be offered, but AV would be, which wasn't proportional, would have been a little bit better than first past the post. And then the Labour Party was also going to campaign against it anyway. The Conservatives, having kept their word that they would allow the referendum, then campaigned against it. So the 2 major parties, and most of the major press were campaigning against it, I think is the reason. I also know some people, personal friends actually, who wanted PR, and they voted against it because they thought that they wanted the works, as it were. They wanted to wait for PR properly. instead of accepting this step in what I thought was in the right direction.
So a corollary, how would you persuade any government to hold a new referendum on the Propoprtional?
I wouldn't ask it to hold a referendum, actually.
How will we get it?
I know this probably sounds a bit conceited, but I say it is our right as voters to have a democratic system that elects a parliament and the government we want. We shouldn't go to a referendum, and it's the politician's duty to provide it. Pretty much as they did for extending the vote from the middle classes to the working classes, and from men to women, and from women over 30 to women over 21, and then for everybody from 21 to 18. We didn't have referendums for any of those, did we?
So do you think that these turkeys are going to vote for Christmas? Do you think Parliament will ever, as currently constituted?
They have voted for other people's Christmas. They voted for Christmas to elect MEPs. They voted for Christmas for the Scottish and the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh and London Assemblies. They voted for Christmas for Northern Ireland. They voted for sort of Christmas for electing directly elected mayors and police and crimes commissioners. I think the next time they vote for Christmas will be for local elections in England. In Wales, incidentally. In Scotland, they've already got it because the Scottish Parliament has power to do it, and they've done it. In Wales, at this very moment, well, this very day or week, their assembly is discussing putting through a bill which will give local authorities in Wales an option between first past the post and single transferable vote. Not really enough on it, but it's a step in the right direction. So I personally think that would be the next thing. It might come on more quickly if we're lucky, if we have a hung parliament, and if the minor parties hang out the PR as a definite price instead of this sort of halfway thing that the Lib Dems did last time. And it could also be that with the present increase in voting other than Labour, and this is going in both directions, sort of Lib Dem, Green and Brexit Party, they're going to have less of a hegemony than they've got now, the major parties, and they might begin to see it in their interest before they go down too far to get PR to protect themselves. Another possibility, if Scotland becomes independent, we could be faced with almost permanent Conservative government. I don't think we will be, because I think people sooner or later get fed up, they want a change of some sort. But it could sort of look that way. Though the Conservatives might think that's a totally good thing if Scotland gets independence while they're in power. But I think if Scotland was getting independence while Labour was in power, I think the first thing they do, or the next thing they do would be PR for England. I'm sure of it. Anyone else? Yes.
Would PR make more hung parliaments?
I'm sorry.
Would having PR make more hung parliaments?
It might do. Some people say they like it to, of course, because, well, as you've seen, that's been a bit of a mess at the moment with the Brexit business, whichever side you're on. At least MPs, I think most of them were trying to represent us as they thought they should, rather than just having to do what the government said. And so I personally think that's a good thing. To the extent that there would be hung parliaments, would obviously depend on how people voted. Voting patterns would change. In a safe, well, if you take someone like, I think it's Sutton Sheen Shorten, that's a Lib Dem Conservative marginal. Labour has a very tiny vote there, but I can't believe there are that few Labour supporters there. Most of them probably vote Lib Dem to try and keep the Tories out. So, funnily enough, in that area, probably fewer people vote Lib Dem because their Labour vote would count. And then vice versa, say in Crawley, which is Conservative Labour marginal, I'm sure quite a lot of Lib Dems are voting either Conservative to keep Labour out or Labour to keep Tories out. So you get more realistic voting wherever. We don't quite know how it would go. The other thing is that depending on the kind of PR, this is another merit of STV in fact, because you've got later choices or preferences, you the voters can indicate what kind of coalition you would like to have. But supposing in 2010 we'd had the kind of result that we did have, but by STV instead of PR, then the Lib Dem leadership would have known if most of their voters had given second preference to Labour, they wouldn't dare to go into coalition with Conservative, or vice versa, because we just don't know, because we don't have second preferences at the moment. I'll hand over to Jonathan now anyway, and you can still ask both of his questions afterwards.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
All right, hi. Thanks very much. So I'm Jonathan Brown. I'm just going to introduce myself first and sort of introduce why I'm here and why I'm talking to you. So I'm a district councillor for Southbourne. I stood for Parliament in 2017. Clearly I didn't win, otherwise I wouldn't be here talking to you this evening, probably. But I have won and lost elections under first past the post. I also lived in Syria for a few years before the war there. So I followed the pro-democracy protests and organisers and organisations as local activists attempted to create their own local democracy and representative councils, and most of them were then crushed. Also, I'd like to just say, do I have a hidden agenda? No, it's an open agenda. I joined the Liberal Democrats. One of the large reasons was because I supported proportional representation. That said, I'm not here this evening to give you a Lib Dem view. I hope pretty much all of what I'm going to say is a pro-proportional representation argument that is applicable whatever party preference you may have. And there are supporters of proportional representation in all parties. Some parties have a lot more support, others less, but there are supporters in all. And I've been on demonstrations, for example, with Diane James, who at the time was one of the leaders of UKIP, calling for proportional representation. So my starting point, really, for even thinking about this is what makes for a quality democracy? Why are we a democracy at all? What are we trying to achieve as a country? And I'm pretty sure most, if not all of us, can agree with these things. We want decision makers to reflect the wishes of the population. We want decision makers to be representative of the population. We want decisions to be made by diverse bodies with strong oppositions where ideas are challenged and tested. We don't want groupthink where everyone agrees with themselves and misses something important. And we don't want single think or dictatorship. Ideally, we want a system, a political system, that inspires and encourages good people to enter politics so that as electors we can have confidence in the integrity and the judgment of people who are elected, even those we don't actually agree with. And we want a system where everyone feels they have a stake, that each and every one of us are only a single person with a single vote, but we want to know that our vote will count and that our views matter. I believe first past the post fails us all in every respect. Having said that, I don't believe, and this might be more controversial, I don't believe most people in politics are crooks. I don't think most set out to be corrupt or useless. But there is no denying that there is widespread dissatisfaction on all sides with our politics and our politicians. I also want to add that proportional representation isn't the answer to everything. There are lots of countries with PR which have some of the same problems we do. And we have a lot of problems that are not really anything to do with our electoral system. But a lot of our problems are impacted by our poor electoral system negatively. So I thought I'd like to talk about some of the issues, big and small, that I encounter as a local politician and as a campaigner on some national issues too. start off with housing and development. So the type and location of new housing, and this is a very controversial issue in the Chichester district at the moment, but in the southeast more generally, there's a lot of people who simply cannot afford to rent or to buy and are really, really struggling. We're building the wrong kind of housing, it's too expensive, and in the process we're carpeting green fields with concrete and brick. We've got governments repeatedly, year after year after year, failing to change the system to get properly affordable housing, failing to stand up to the big developers who I think in the last year contributed, for example, over £1 million to the Conservative Party. And why is this relevant to proportional representation? Because in this area, there simply aren't the votes in dealing with some of these issues. There is a majority in this area of people who are wealthy enough to own their own homes and are therefore relatively unaffected by a lot of these housing issues. And younger people growing up hoping to either buy or rent know that they face 20 years saving for a deposit. They don't think that far ahead. I didn't think that far ahead for an awful long time. It's easier to think about moving out of the area than it is to think about affording somewhere here. There's a lot of people in this area who think it's crazy that we are proposing to build a lot of housing on floodplains. In 40 years' time, 60 years' time, a lot of the housing we already have is going to be underwater. And we're proposing to build more housing in areas which we know will be underwater. But the votes of people who want to build elsewhere simply don't outweigh the votes of those who don't want to build in their own backyard. This relates to the next issue I want to talk about, which is sort of jobs and skills and economic opportunities for people. A lot of the Midlands and the North East and the southwest of England have had decades of underinvestment in jobs. A lot of the heavy industry closed and relatively little of it. I say it sort of encourages and it's built into the system that you have coalition governments. If you have a coalition government, they are almost by nature more stable because they represent a larger number of voters, and in coming to a coalition, you go into an election with the parties indicating what their red lines are, who they're likely to work together, where they have common ground with other parties. After an election, they can form a coalition, and typically the larger party, their leader, will lead that coalition. And being more stable, you're less likely to have changes. We've had repeated unelected prime ministers in this country because we've had hung parliaments in a very unstable system with minority governments in a system designed for majorities. And when one prime minister fails, the party has simply been able to elect a new leader, and that's a byproduct, if you like, of our current system.
No,
Absolutely.
obviously we've got a very adversarial system the way we are, and that sets the tone for debate in Parliament, and indeed we've seen the effect that that's had recently in terms of society and how people contact somebody who has a different view from them, who's in the public eye, and how they're abused. Is there any evidence to say that in systems elsewhere in Europe that there's less of that animosity or that level of hatred? I mean, some of the press reporting recently about how people are behaving and the way they're speaking is unrecognisable to me. For us in the UK to be speaking to one another like that.
I don't know is the short answer. I suspect not, because it would probably be quite hard to unentangle it from a lot of other issues. There are plenty of countries where you have minority parties with very extreme views represented. So with PR, I don't think you're very likely to eliminate hate speech. I think you are more likely, however, to have that hate speech out in the open and have it challenged. And you've got more of a safety valve. People that support those extremist parties can be represented. Their representatives can fail and let those people down and be voted out of office again. And that minority of people who want to vote for an extremist party can continue to do so, and there is some outlet for them. But unless that extremist party moderates and is willing to work with others and tone down some of the things they say, then I think they're generally unlikely to get very far. They're unlikely to hold the balance of power. And I don't want to. I'm not wanting to imply that the groups that are currently leading the Conservative and Labour parties are equivalent to some of these really racist minority parties you get in Europe, or even indeed in the UK. Happy to talk about that outside of this conversation if you want to. I just want to make a point that within the Labour Party you have a leadership controlling a very large party that, if we had a proportional representation system, would likely have been a separate party that would probably not poll more than 10% of the vote. And you have a Conservative Party, which again is now being led by a wing of the party that again probably would not poll more than 10%, 10-15% of the vote on its own. And I say I'm not trying to read anything into who those groups are. I'm not making any comment on that. Just that personally, I think it would be better if, as a country, we could vote for the components of the coalition government rather than have a small part, a wing of one particular party, take over a much larger party and then impose that on us.
Do you have one more question before the break, or anyone last question before a break?
A question about the way a PR system would change the political parties we have. Would you expect them to fragment? What would be the effect on the parties?
Again, short answer is I don't know. My guess is that I think the reality might be less different than the perception. It sort of touches on my previous answer. Is today's Labour Party the same as the Labour Party of 1997 when Tony Blair won a big majority? I don't think so. Whether that's good or bad, I'm not making any comment, but I think it's a different party. With proportional representation, I think it would appear that parties would grow and shrink and split and merge more frequently, but I'm not sure that the underlying sort of voter preferences would necessarily be changing that dramatically. I think probably the parties would split, and I think that will be a good thing. I wouldn't be surprised if my party, the Lib Dems, split, which actually I quite like being in a party that has a left wing and a right wing. I wouldn't want it to split, but if proportional representation means that my party ended up splitting into as in the Netherlands, there is a sort of a centre-left Liberal Party and a centre-right Liberal Party. I'd prefer to be living in a country with a system where people have that choice. I suspect parties would split, and I think that would be a healthy thing, and all of the parties would benefit as well as the voters would benefit.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. Let's have a break and think up some more questions. Yeah. I thought
the local ballot paper, you know, that 10 ballot paper. I thought it was very good. Because it made you realise that you can vote for different issues.
And it's your second
So you still think that's yeah, that's fun. Yeah. The only thing I didn't understand is how will people decide how many numbers because you can fill them all up.
We managed to work it out. Several months ago, we released a final say. 2 nights ago, you say, so what do you say? Last night I wrote it. Oh, right.
You know, it's
Yeah, so see what I mean. Well, how would you say how many? I suppose you just say, well,
I'm not on speech anyway, Kate's going to be there.
The Electoral Reform Society, allied organisations, I suppose. In fact, I am a member of the Electoral Reform Society. I was its president for a couple of years. But I think it's important to try and do things locally as well as nationally. The Electoral Reform Society's, in one sense, it's got a narrower aim than Make Votes Matter, because the only PR system it supports is single transferable vote, whereas Make Votes Matter aims more for the principle of proportional representation. On the other hand, in other ways, the Electoral Reform Society goes a bit wider than Make Votes Matter, because it's interested in a host of other things like voting age and House of Lords reform and MPs' expenses and this, that and the other. Then again, Make Votes County West Sussex is yet another organisation, the purely local one, and our brief is simply to promote PR for public elections and to promote it in this area. Although the committee happens to believe that SPP is the best system. So I hope that answered that question. The other question was, one argument against PR is that it's too complicated for voters. How can we argue against that? Well, that's one I hear quite often, and I think it's a bit insulting actually to say that English and Welsh people can't handle systems that the Scottish and Irish can, or New Zealanders and Dutch and Swiss and Germans. Do you want me to go on? But you get the general idea anyway. Any other questions? Not just me, but give Jonathan an exercise as well.
Jonathan, could I ask, you mentioned sort of devolving more power to local government. Part of the concern I've got at the moment, because that has been happening quite a lot, partly probably for financial reasons, how do we make sure that we have equity across the country in terms of the services that we provide? If we devolve, I understand we have to react to local needs and they will be different in different communities, but how do we protect equity across our country for access to services?
This is kind of not a proportional representation
No, it's not,
question.
but you mentioned
No,
it, so I'm asking.
I think there's sort of two elements to that. One is, I talked about devolving power. Power without money isn't power in politics. So whether that is tax money going to central government and then being handed to local government to spend, or preferably, in my view, local government raising money so that less, so it doesn't mean more taxes, it means rather than sending most money to central government and then sending it to local government, central government raises less, but local government raises more, and you therefore have more accountable government, more responsive government, because it's responding to the local voters' wishes. You certainly can have rules on, and we do already have some rules on sharing and equalisation. So a proportion of the money that wealthy areas raise will be effectively taxed and then redistributed to poorer areas. The other part of the argument, I think, really is that we already live in an unequal country. If we devolve more power, we will continue to be a country that has unequal outcomes in different places. And there's no getting around that, but there is no system that will give equal results everywhere. And in some ways, different results in different places is actually an advantage. So if you've got a part of the country where, for sort of historical reasons, there are a lot of lung infections because of the nature of the work people did, for example, then you may well want the local NHS to invest more in that certain service, and there is a danger and that would be at the expense of something else. But there is no perfect system which allocates all the money that is necessary to everything at the same time. So at the very least, you have a local government or local system that can respond to local needs and meet local priorities. And then it's up to the local people to determine what those priorities are. And if they think it's gone too far towards lung health, then they can send a message to local government they want it to redistribute another way.
Just before another question comes, could I just mention something I meant to mention earlier? It's not really part of the talk though. You may have noticed this up here. We've called it a democrometer. So to measure democracy in your views. A few questions here, such as, are you thinking of voting tactically next month? Is leaving or staying in the EU important to you? It doesn't really matter for this purpose whether you're a keen Remainer or a keen Leaver, but you know, is it important one way or the other? Various other questions. If you'd like sometime before you go, please, to put stickers on the answers, yes, no or maybe, we'd be very interested to see that. The colours are not significant, they don't mean party or anything else. So you just put a sticker in the square that represents your views on these 6 questions. And, it's a sort of light-hearted, fun way of looking at it, and we find it quite interesting. So I'll just leave you to think about that and perhaps do it just before you go.
Presumably the results can be emailed to people or put on the Facebook page or something.
But we could also put it online as well for get more results as well, if you like.
Yeah, well I can send it to you.
Do.
Andrew, okay.
Soon as no one's asking anything, it's suggested that the parliamentary system we've got is a big driver of climate change, from the UK, as it were, because of the short-termism, 5 years or less, that and no single party is going to be willing to put sort of measures really in that are really going to make a difference. And the Citizens' Assembly is often put forward. Have you any views on that?
I don't really know. I certainly agree that not just in question of climate change, but many things, there's too much short-termism in British politics, because the main interest of a party, well, particularly the major two parties is to win the next election, which is never more than 5 years away. One of the accusations against PR, as you know, is it causes instability, but I think Jonathan covered this very well when he was speaking. I think it would actually be more stable because you get a larger coalition, a genuine coalition, rather than a coalition of one party, which can change hands if it changes hands at the top. We've seen that in both major parties over the last 10 or 20 years. So I think it would reduce short-termism, which would probably also help with climate change. And the other thing is, if I could say so, is that the Green Party as a party, I suspect, is much smaller than the number of people who support its broad principles.
Yes.
And I think that is probably partly because, well, it's a chicken and egg situation, isn't it? They feel, well, it's not a big party, I can't vote for it, I'm wasting my vote, so I'll vote for one of the others. And
Well,
so on.
they say that 80% of the population are now aware. So,
Yeah. So PR would probably empower people to vote Green if that's what they really wanted. And of course, more did in the European elections, and they do in the European elections, which is by PR, than they do by first past the post for other elections. But also with single transferable votes in particular, even if you were in a constituency where the Green Party was very weak and simply couldn't get enough votes to elect one of the 5 MPs, then your next preference would be for the green-minded Lib Dem, or the green-minded Labour, or the green-minded Conservative candidate. So you would at least be able to influence the other parties a bit more. So I hope that helps you.
yeah, I really like the idea of a citizens' assembly. They use them in Ireland to sort out the abortion issue, and in Iceland to sort out the banking issue and things, because that sort of takes important decisions to some extent that need a long-term solution away from the short-termism. Do you favour citizens' assemblies?
Yes. I mean, this is one of the, I didn't mention it before when I was being asked about how we might actually get PR, but this is one of the possible ways.
Yeah.
In that a citizens' assembly would be representative, probably more representative than Parliament is, although it shouldn't be. But more particularly, it would be free of party domination.
Yes.
There was a citizens' assembly in British Columbia in 2004. They had some advisors, and they took evidence from various people, not just from politicians, but from psychologists and such like, you know, academics who are interested in voting systems, and they recommended a version of single transferable vote as it happened, and a majority of people in British Columbia voted for it in a referendum. But unfortunately, the provincial government had set an arbitrary target of 60% of the votes, and I forget how many, percentage of the constituencies, or ridings as they call them there, and it just failed on that. I think it was about 58% voted for PR, because the provincial government said it wouldn't act unless 60% did, nothing happened. But that was a citizens' assembly.
I'd just like to know more about how proportional representation would come into in England, or in the UK. In England, really. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just beginning.
How would it come in?
Oh, I see.
How would it change?
Well, as I said earlier, I think it's more likely to come in for local government than for Parliament first. Because, you know, as they say, turkeys don't vote for Christmas, or not for their own Christmas, they might vote for someone else's Christmas. I think also there's more support within the major parties for that. I mean, I know Labour people in this area would like PR for local government, and they're more interested in PR for local government than they are for national government. As I'm sure you know, they haven't had any Chichester District Councillors for quite a long time, until 2 were elected this year. you know, the reverse, of course, in Labour heartland, where the Conservatives aren't represented. I mean, there are some councils, no, I can't think of any offhand, but there are certainly one or two councils where there are 100% Labour representation.
If I can define my question a bit more, if the power that be in local government is in power because of the electoral system we're using, so it's not in their interests basically to get more proportional
Well,
representation.
the power to change it in
How
local
is it going
government.
to change?
The change to power in local government is with national government. They're reluctant to sort of let PR have a foot in the door, as it were. Although they have in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, so and in the European elections. So it's not impossible. I mean, the other thing I said was that I don't just think, I feel very sure if Scotland becomes independent while we have a Labour government, then immediately after the independence bill, they'll bring in a PR bill. Because otherwise they know they're a dead party.
Can I
Yeah.
wanted to say a thing about both of those questions. The local government is not allowed to choose its own electoral system. And I'm sure that's quite deliberate. National government does not want local government setting a precedent for proportional representation. But it does mean that if it changed, parties couldn't win a majority and then change it back again. Single transferable votes for local elections in Scotland came as a result of the Lib Dems negotiating it in coalition with Labour when they were in coalition government together. And although the Lib Dems have ruled out going to coalition with either Labour or the Conservatives in this general election, the thinking in Lib Dem circles and sort of strategy is to prioritise single transferable vote for local government, so that if at any point in the future there are coalition negotiations with someone, it could be held up as a red line and said, we got completely burned over AV referendum last time, we're not doing that. It was in our manifesto, the public voted for it, maybe only a minority, but only a minority voted for your party as well. Therefore, part of the price of coalition is bringing in STV for local government. And we think that is a more likely way of opening the door than, sadly, winning a majority Liberal Democrat government or getting it as a part of a coalition with another government. On the climate change issue and sort of long-termism generally, I think it's even worse than the two of you have said, because another reason I joined the Lib Dems was because of their environmentalism. We sometimes find ourselves in a position where, take a hypothetical local government ward with a population of, say, 3,000 electors, of whom 2,000 are entitled to vote. Maybe 800 of them will vote at election time. To win, we need, let's say, 300 to 400 votes, assuming the rest of the vote gets split with a number of other parties. If we know that 100 people are going to vote Green, no matter what we say or do, then we may face a choice of assembling our majority by targeting the 100 people who we know are going to vote Green, or 200 maybe conservative leaning voters who are prepared to switch, who may or may not care about the environment, but their priority may be something else. So, and I'm just using us as an example, we are incentivised to write off certain proportions of the population. So not only do the Greens get horrifically discriminated against by first past the post and lack the representation of people that vote for them, and lack the representation of people who feel they can't vote for them because it would be a wasted vote, but actually it's even worse because it potentially undermines green movements in other parties. And although that was the example you raised, Labour would say exactly the same thing about us on civil liberties, for example, or a whole range of... The principle is the same on a whole range of issues, that under first past the post, if you're trying to assemble as many votes as possible, obviously, you don't need 100%, you don't need anything close to 100%, you rarely even need 50%, but if you know that a proportion of votes that you would like to target are definitely going to vote for another party, you don't necessarily have an incentive to prioritise going after those votes. With a preferential or a proportional system, you absolutely do, because you want those people who may well want to cast their first preference for Green, you want them to give you your second preference. So a better, fairer electoral system bakes in building support and growing support for taking action against climate change or a range of other issues. I think, finally, on this same subject, because with proportional representation, national government or any government is more likely to require coalitions, there is more incentive, I think, for coalition partners to negotiate and try and seek compromises that work broadly. You can't simply just force what you want on another party. Under our current system, if you win a majority, you get the right to do almost anything you like, you bring the policy in, and then another party comes in, and they're incentivised to just scrap whatever you did and change it. If there is a constant negotiation over years and years and years and decades, you're more likely to be seeking partnership with other parties, keeping your options open for coalitions in future. Because who knows, maybe one part of your coalition will switch and go into a coalition with another party in future. You've got a better chance, I believe, of evolving in a positive way and keeping good policies in force.
Can I ask a question? Is there a minimum size of party, and presumably independence wouldn't exist in the PR system, is that correct?
No.
So can you clarify that for me then?
Well, with STV, if you remember the slide that I put in Mary Poppins as an independent.
All right, so you can have independence then?
Yeah, I mean, she was just, I mean, I haven't gone into details of exactly how STV works, but basically, to be elected, the candidate has to reach a certain quota of votes. So, but that's the candidate, not the party. So, if two candidates of the same party each get the quota, then that party has got two candidates elected. If there's an independent standing on her own, and she's got the quota, then she's elected. With the list system, we don't know for certain what's going to be this time. And partly, you know, the man or woman in the street should be reasonably aware, if they've got a slight interest in politics, that their vote will actually count, and then they might elect someone. Theirs might be the deciding vote. But perhaps more important than that, as you know, do you think Jeremy Corbyn or Boris Johnson are going to come to Chichester? No, because Jeremy's going to assume that Labour isn't going to win anyway, and Boris is going to assume that Tories will win anyway. But they'll be going to all the marginal constituencies, they'll be in Crawley, they'll be in Portsmouth South and so on. But every area will be marginal with any form of PR, in fact, although especially I think with STV. So the parties would have to put a lot more effort and publicity into their campaigns, which would sort of raise the profile and bring out some people who perhaps don't normally bother, you know, attending politics.
You know, when you deal with or knowledge of the Labour and Conservatives, who are the opponents for the system, do they treat it in a derisory way? I mean, they must be afraid of the idea. Is that what's their generally when you meet MPs for Conservatives and Labour. I mean, we don't have that. We don't have any of them here, so we don't know. But what do they think about
The
it?
MPs tend to say, well, there's no demand for it. And we had a referendum in 2011, which is beside the point because it wasn't on that's a very good question, because actually it also brings me back to that lady said can't wait for it. Tell your MP, when you know who your MP is, that you want PR. And before you know who your MP is, write to all the candidates and tell them you want PR. Don't give them any excuse to say that the public don't want it, please.
I think the other things we kind of tend to hear is deflection arguments. So we've already had a referendum is one of the deflection arguments. There's no demand for it, that's another deflection argument. Depending on who the audience is and who else is listening to this argument, you may hear arguments along the lines of it's the way we've always done it, and if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Many of us would argue it's broken, but if you keep winning power despite getting minority votes, then I guess you would argue that it's not broken. You sometimes also get, and I feel we get this more from Labour than from Conservatives, which is the priority right now is to beat the Tories and bring about social justice, which you may or may not agree with, but it's a way of avoiding dealing with PR, with the question of PR. I suppose you also, another good deflection argument is, but we really value the constituency link, which we've already taken on that argument and explained how you can maintain a constituency link with proportional representation. But again, I think the same is true for a lot of political debates. A lot of politicians, when they're faced with answering questions on what they really know is indefensible, all they need is an answer to fill the space to enable the debate to move on to something else. So if they're being interviewed on TV, they need an answer that will enable them to fill the time so the question and moved on to something else.
Depressing.
Could I just add that among voters, polling found that a majority of Conservative voters are in favour of proportional representation, and an even larger majority of Labour voters.
Right.
And there is some considerable diversity of opinion among MPs, particularly in Labour. A substantial minority of Labour MPs are in favour of PR, and even one Conservative.
More questions?
Going back to ladies there who can't wait. You can help to reduce the waiting time, perhaps. This is my sales pitch by joining Votes Counting West Sussex. You've all got a leaflet. It's got various ways of contacting us, so please do that.
It's free. It's free.
Yes,
All donations are welcome.
Yes. I've also got a few sign-up sheets here. You can fill that in and give it to me, or you can contact us by phone, post, or email.
Any more questions? I could ask questions all night, but I don't want to hog the thing. I was going to mention the B word, Brexit. Would the referendum have happened if we'd had a PR system?
I think it would be less likely to have happened, and that's not saying that Brexit wouldn't have happened, but I think because the House of Commons wasn't representative democracy failed, so they changed to direct democracy. In other words, asking several million non-experts to make a decision on a very complicated matter, instead of getting 650 people who are highly paid to make difficult decisions to make the decision. And I think in particular, I make no apologies for pressing my case for HTV as opposed to other PL systems. With HTV, if X% of Labour voters had voted for Remain candidates, then X% of Labour MPs would have been Remainers. If Y% of Conservative voters had voted for Remain MPs, then Y% of Conservative MPs would have been Remainers. Leavers, obviously. So Parliament would be more representative. And because with preference voting, it's easier everything isn't in black and white, it's not binary. It's easier to say, well, yeah, I think I like that person because they're more open-minded on it. They're not completely happy with the EU, but they don't necessarily want to leave. You know, they're sort of in-between views, which tend to get overlooked. And I think there might have been more MPs and they could have actually come to a decision themselves, one way or the other. But which way, I don't know, obviously.
I think it wouldn't have happened because I don't think people would have wanted it. Conversely, I think if people had wanted it, then it would have happened. And I say that for a few reasons. And I say this as a Remainer who didn't want to leave and still wants to stay. But nevertheless, I did a lot of campaigning during the referendum and heard a lot of different reasons why people wanted to leave. Most of which I agreed with. I just didn't accept that leaving was going to make that outcome happen. So a lot of the reasons, some of the reasons people wanted to leave was because they were being ignored. They were. There's no two ways about that. Most people in this country, their opinions, their political opinions are ignored and are not represented. I don't think Brexit is going to change that, but plenty of people voted leave as a way of sending a message that you can't ignore us any longer. Some people voted leave because they wanted to send a message about managing migration. For some people, it was quite simple, they just wanted fewer immigrants. I don't, but I do believe people that want fewer immigrants should be represented in politics. And if those people had been represented by councillors and MPs, their arguments would have been heard, which in itself would have been a good thing. I believe they'd have been challenged as well. A lot of the people who were concerned about immigration were really concerned about access to public services. So they weren't worried about having black neighbours, they weren't worried about the principle of foreign people coming to this country and becoming part of our community. They were worried about ever increasing waiting times at doctor surgeries. If we had a PR system, their votes would have been able to cast their votes for parties and politicians who would have prioritised those issues, meaning they would never have become issues in a referendum on Brexit. So, and I sort of hinted at this earlier when I talked about sort of having a more consensual Brexit or a more consensual Remain, that the problem this country has, whether we go through with Brexit or whether we stay, is that there is a lot of division about what we're trying to even achieve by leaving. There's a lot of division about the impact of leaving or of staying. And if we had a more representative politics, then our politics would reflect and hold these debates and have the chance of coming up with solutions to some of them. That solution might involve leaving the EU, might not. Either way, we would be coming up with some of the solutions to problems that people wanted politicians to talk about, wanted politicians to do something about, and they didn't.
Well, thanks very much. We're approaching 9:30. Julian's got a couple of announcements, but before that, I'd like to say thank you very much for engaging debates and